I'm back with another episode of Hammer Meet Anvil, this time with RZL. And he is a man who's got many maps. Now, in the past, my intros, I try to make it less obvious that I'm reading off of a script where I write out all of the different maps that people have been part of. But this guy has made so many maps, has been a part of so many collaborations down the years. So I am just going to read it off a list. And I hope you guys can forgive me for that one. So the first one that was most recent was obviously Engage with Bubkiz and Cat Food. And more recently, a little bit further back, we have Basalt with Yanzel and Oliver. You may remember that as my personal favorite from that particular contest, so it's always nice to have the man responsible for that on here. A little bit further back, there was a bit of an incomplete map, but still one that I thought warranted mention is Highlands with El Moros and Electro Sheep. Going further back, Grind with Man Man and the Horse Strangler. Then Concert with Skybex and Resort with Yanzel. And he's even got a couple other ones in his back pocket if you wanted to go super deep. But I'm not sure that we'll get there just yet. We'll see how it goes. But how you doing, man?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, of course. I wanted to first ask, as our introductory probing question here, about Engage specifically, because obviously it's the most recent map. Before we started the show, you said that you were primarily the level design guy, and I was curious as to how much work on level design actually ended up having to happen on Engage, because obviously that was a map that, according to people's sources, they say that Bubkiz had already kind of had that map laid out to some extent. So how did that sort of go about for you? What were your contributions to the level design of Engage?
Yeah, so Engage started out as a 1.6 map by Bubkiz, like you said, and then Bubkiz eventually approached me and asked me if I wanted to make a CSGO map out of it. And yeah, and I had a look at it. It is very much a 1.6 map. So but I saw like a lot of potential in it and like very much uniqueness to it as well. Like especially the A bomb side was striking me as a very cool thing to have, which I really wanted to also translate into the CSGO map. So yeah, then I just went ahead and I ported, I think, the map, the 1.6 map to CSGO first, and made it possible, made it playable, and then we were just playtesting at the start, and to just see like what its strengths and weaknesses are, and then from there on, I started to make adjustments to make it more in line with what we are familiar with in CSGO maps. So, for example, the vent in Engage in the 1.6 version was a vent that you could only crouch in, and it was like really slow, and you would drop instead of being able to look, open the vent and then look into the bomb site, right? So it was like quite a bit different to how it is now. So that we changed that to be like a thing where you can just walk through without having to crouch all the way. And another thing was also the path towards the B bomb site. It was a drop down at first, and then you were going up some stairs to the bomb site, which caused some head peak angle into the bomb site, which we also then simplified by not having it a drop down, be more of a corridor, which you can see now in the game, and made it generally more spacious for bomb site. So the ceilings were pretty low on that map as well, especially like on B side. So yeah, we gave it more breathing room basically to make more use of your utility.
One of the things that I'm really interested about when going back in and looking at a 1.6 map, essentially this was initially, like you said, you called it a very 1.6 map. Like it was very obvious that it didn't come from the same era that we're used to now. What are like the defining characteristics, generally speaking? Like are most 1.6 maps, do they most of them have that crouch event or the drop down and headshot angle? Is that something that like essentially, do you think that the evolution in mapping has been because of people getting better at mapping, and so they make those those mistakes less often, or do you think that it's actually a difference between the different games? Is there a bit of both, or what do you think?
No, I don't think it's worse per se. Like it is very much like how it used to be back then, right? Back then, streamlining how a level flows was not really the biggest concern, right? We are just basically the engagements were a bit different back then, and that's why now when you go into CSGO, all the paths they are like smooth. You don't have to jump too many times to get to a point, right? Like Tetris in Mirage, for example, or like where the stairs are now on Mirage A side, right?
Yeah, it used to
Then
be this thing you had to jump around, or people thought they had to jump, but they didn't really. So there was just they removed it and called it a staircase now. So
yeah, pretty much, right? And oh no, T-spawn, you meant that one, right?
yes, which
Yeah,
stairs were you
oh no.
talking about?
Well, on the A side, you had like these in the 1.6 version. It had like from mid the entrance, it had like boxes that you could climb and then look at the palace, or what
Yes,
is now
yes.
palace, right? Uh, and that has been streamlined, right? Now it's a staircase, right? It's similar, fulfills like a similar role, right? But it has been done so that newer players who are not as familiar with the game, and that they can enjoy it without having to like crouch jump, for example, to get to places.
Do you think that there's room for maps that require a bit more familiarity with the game, like you're saying? Like, do you think, for example, there's I always see this argument come up where when anytime there's a situation where there's like a small area of a certain map in matchmaking that demands a certain amount of movement skill or precision or familiarity with the game and how the mechanics work. Some
Mhm.
people will be on the side of saying you should actually like remove that because it's like too demanding for lower skill players. Other people are saying it's a celebration of whoever is good enough. Like overpass when you go down a long and you can jump from the bench to that little upraised area and on the CT side, like that's a movement check in a sense, right? And Mirage
Yeah,
window jumping up from window to the bricks and then getting into that vent to rotate to B. It's a very, very powerful move if you can pull it off, but it is a movement check and it puts you in a vulnerable position. So,
yeah.
in some cases, on a terms of like whether or not it's map balance, I think it's kind of obvious that it balances itself out. It's risk reward. But do you think it's actually good for the game to have more of that, or do you think there could be a map that has most of the jumps in the game, or more of the jumps in that map are require that level of movement in order to pull off a certain successful maneuver?
No, I think we are in a good spot right now. Like, I don't think maps should have too many of these gimmicks. I feel like that is a gimmick, like the window jump in Mirage, for example. It is a really concentrated thing that you have like only like in very few places on a map, and if you have more than just like one or two of these, then it becomes excruciating because well, like the skill check that you're saying, right? If that's becomes something that you have to do every round, then it becomes like a chore, and failing it like over and over again is not really a nice feeling for the player, right? So really making it something that happens only in locations where you don't have to take that route, right? But gives you like a nice shortcut. Then it's good. But I don't think you should go overboard with all these little movement checks that you could have. So yeah, I think like one or two of these movement checks in a map are good, but yeah, you got to be careful, I think.
One of the sort of backstories to how those even develop in the first place is usually they're not put there deliberately by developers, as far as I understand. Usually they're discovered. It's almost like, you're going into this new environment and you're discovering this little trick you can do, because most of the time they start out as boosts. Like, oh, you can, if you have teamwork, you can boost up to that thing in Mirage window, or you can, on Cobblestone, you could boost up to that tree position if you really wanted to, but you could also do a long jump if you know how those work, or if you build up enough
Mhm.
momentum on a B hop or something. So there's ways that people kind of discover how to do it, if they can do it reliably, if they can do it really well as a their own player. So my next question for you is: are there positions that you suspect that might be the case in something like Engage, like with some of your recent maps? Do you think that there's a position there where a really good movement player could potentially break the balance of the map if they were good enough?
Oh boy. So there's like this, but I don't think it's really jump that is giving you an advantage. It's just when you come out of lower mid as a terrorist and you want to go up to upper mid, there's like this car and the big shelf that you can jump on, and from there you could possibly jump over to the upper mid thing, but it's
On the
not
B
really
rotate, like
breaking.
you could go from that shelf to the B rotate. Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
okay.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But I don't know. I can't make this jump. I'm sure like other people can, but I don't think it's like game breaking really. And I hope there's nothing really like that. But that like what you just said, it brings up like a good point, right? So you design like a skill check, right? Okay, so you design already like let's say 5 skill checks,
Yes.
and the players find 5 more, and then you have like 10 skill checks already in a map, which is like overwhelming for everyone, right? So yeah, I would want it to keep it at the lower side, give players the opportunity to find ways to find shortcuts themselves, and then say, yeah, it's a feature now, right?
Of course, yeah.
You won't fix it if it doesn't break, of course.
One of the things I'm curious about too regarding how a level designer would look at some of these maps and like how you essentially design maps. Do you think that there's a sort of another layer of skill that as a level designer that you could reach if you got really really good at the game, like better than you are currently at the game? Is that something that like plays a really big part in determining like how good your levels can be, or do you think that the skill of yourself doesn't necessarily matter in the game as long as you can supplement it with other things, like you can refine it over time after getting testing done from high skill players? Like to what extent do you think that the skill at playing the game Counter-Strike influences your ability to design levels for Counter-Strike?
uh, I think this like the more you play, you hit like a not the ceiling, but like a soft ceiling, basically, right? Where uh, you should definitely know the fundamentals of a game and be like really familiar with how it plays before you can actually make a map that is um, having the like essence of what the CS:GO maps. Um, how do you say? What the essence of a CS:GO map is, basically, right? So you should really be already be familiar with the game by playing it. But I feel also sometimes it clouds your judgment a bit as well when you get too familiar with it, because then you don't really have this lens of how a new player could perceive it. So, for example, you have like this one path where you have to do a crouch jump to get up, right? Like on Basalt, there was this little when you go from the T spawn to the B bomb site, you have like this little terrace where you can jump up from a few crates, and you have to do a crouch jump to get on top of it. And when I was showing it to a friend of mine, he didn't know the how to do a crouch jump, right? And he was like, "Is this broken? Right? Like I can't get up there, right?"
Yeah.
And like stuff like this is like, oh, okay, damn, okay, I have to raise the displacements a bit higher so you can actually more easily get up there, right? Like stuff like this where you have to keep in mind that newer players will also want to enjoy a map and not just players who are really familiar with how the map works or the game works. Yeah.
Are there any positions in Engage or things like that that you feel like you initially had a really good initial idea, you put it together, and then it something falls apart when you play test it or anything like that? And any examples for either Engage or Basalt, since both of those are pretty recent, but any cases where you were working on a level and you're like, all right, let's test this, and then something happened and it became obvious it wasn't going to work?
Um, oh yeah. So on Basalt there was this really big point of contention of if does it work or doesn't it work, and it took me like probably the longest time working on the map to figure out how to make it work, because like what I thought on Basalt was an important thing was that the terrorists had 2 entrances into the middle, and actually also like I wanted the short path into A side for terrorists to be like direct through the building directly into the A side, but they should also be able to jump out of the window into mid, which is now a door, right?
Yes.
So that window, it was like causing a lot of problems for the players and for me how to solve it, because players were overwhelmed by when they ran past that window. They could get shot from the middle and from A side, right? And I was thinking, yeah, you use utility to close off one or the other, and then you can pass through. But players are not really like too willing at the beginning to do these, to use utility to effectively use a path. So it had to be like really streamlined and made sure that it's more linear, basically, what engagements you have, right? It's more like, so you have more of a clear front line that you have to deal with. So that had to change over time, and now basically I had to close the path towards the A side completely and just make it a path that leads into mid, and from there we have to gain control and take the control connector through the garage to get into A side. And I tried a lot of different variations of how I can make it work. Like at first, at some point, I also had an entrance in the same building with a building that had the green building that had the balcony now, right? So you had overall 5 entrances into mid, which was a bit too much also for the players, and also the path was a bit too narrow and too claustrophobic for players. So I had to really find like a balance of how can I make this work with not too many sidelines, without creating too many sidelines, basically, and not ruining any timings. Yeah.
It's a very compact map generally, Basalt. Like I feel like when you look at the map, it almost seems like it feels bigger than it actually is, because you have all those outskirts and the wraparound positions that you can take if you wanted to take the long route as the tees. But ultimately, a lot of the action is centered around that centerpiece. How did you come up with the idea, generally speaking, of having this position in middle where essentially like most of the time, I feel like the paradigm is the high ground. It almost usually belongs to the counter terrorists in CS:GO maps. Like if there's going to be a high ground to mid, you think like Mirage in the window or something, and the terrorists are the ones moving through the low ground if they have to, or something like that. So how did you come up with the idea to sort of invert that and make it so that there's these two positions, one on the low, one on the high, that terrorists have access to, and that the CTs have to worry about both of them? Was that like a centerpiece that you had already thought of and tried before, or was that new to this specific map?
No, I think that was new to this specific map. Um, yeah, I don't know. Before I start working on a map, I just make on paper. I just draw a layout, very high level, which just showcases the flow of how the players are going to move through the space, and there I tried to find like something, and that in that high level layout already what is going to be unique to the map, and where I wanted to connect the a short path with middle, something that not has not been seen a lot. I think Mirage would be an example where you have a wrap around where you come from the underpass up into middle as a terrorist, right? Something like that. But I didn't want to. I wanted it more to be like a faster route instead of something where you have to move all around, all the way around middle, and then be underneath a window, for example, right? So I wanted basically my goal was to create like two front lines, like a crossfire, where you had one angle check the other, like the the Whale Research Institute building, the B-side building. You had a line of sight from there towards the upper path. Both were kind of on the high ground, um, and then you had the other entrances, which were another. I'm gesticulating, but it's outside of the camera. uh, but yeah, So I wanted to have this crossfire situation there, and that was like the most important thing. By giving it two different height levels, I didn't want it to be boring, basically, by just having two lines of sight which are on the same height.
In a way, it's almost like a microcosm of what ended up happening with Engage's A site, like to draw back to that particular map where there's so much in the way of height variation. And obviously,
Yeah.
you kind of, again, in a compact manner, but you still played upon that trope in the middle of Basalt, I feel like. So, what do you think about height in general in CS? Because some of the only other cases of that level of height disparity from like the C or the T entrance into mid that's up on the raised floor and the lowest point that you can get to as a CT holding it by the toolbox and stuff like that, or by the van, is I guess you could make an argument that it's something like Cache B site, where if you're up on Heaven and looking down, or like Train A site with Heaven, pretty much anywhere where there's a Heaven, it almost is like that. But you almost put a Heaven in mid in that sense. What do you think about height as it pertains there? Do you think that's like an underexplored thing? Because we haven't seen too many maps that play around with height to that level.
Yeah. So about Engage first. I think that was like what made the A side really unique in itself, because it had this pretty drastic change in height on that bomb site, and I felt that was quite exciting. And we also simplified it though, right? Because in the the 1.6 version, it had a third layer like in between the highest and the lowest layer, so it was like three levels that were in there, and a ladder, and there was a lot of stuff going on in there, which we tried then to simplify by having the middle layer be just like this very straight path that you can only come out of a door, and nothing really to wrap around on that level. And the connecting the lowest layer with the highest layer, we did the staircase, right? But yeah, and on Basalt, I think I was actually more conservative with height than on my previous projects, because I was a bit concerned about the problems I had with height variation in the other maps that I've been working on, and how much time it took to make adjustments to those. Because whenever you have to make one change to an area, it propagates to like a lot of other areas in
Yes.
the map as well. And I didn't want to go too crazy with that in that map, because we were on a rather tight deadline really with that for the contest. So I wanted it to be some height variation, which we have, right, but not too crazy than in my other blockouts that I've been working on before, which took a lot of time to fix, or not even to continue really.
Right. Well, because of course there is that map. I mean, it almost has height in the name. It's Highlands, and that one, as far as I can tell, was never actually fully finished. If that's
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
that's a situation where obviously that map plays on height. You've got like one of the bomb sites itself being rather elevated compared to the other one. And I believe, is it the B bomb site that's up on high in the mountains?
It's both sides,
Yeah.
yes. It's
Okay.
inside a castle, really.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So do you think that in that sort of situation where you were previously experimenting with height, like one thing I've noticed with Engage's A site is that people seem to like, they want to stand on the railings, they want to play around like Death's Edge where they might fall over, and depending on how much damage they've taken, they might die. Right. But they're so desperate to get like an angle to shoot somebody. And so they really want to play around with it. It seems almost like because there's the potential to fall down, people are more encouraged to do it almost. So I was curious as to your thoughts, generally speaking, with like you alluded to some issues that you had with height in your previous maps. Do you think that like part of it is just fall damage? Do you think part of it is, figuring out how to like sort of allow players to like know where they should be aiming? Because sometimes like maps will have these like little hints that say, oh, place your crosshair at around this height level or something like that.
Mhm.
Are there just more issues the more height variation you implement into the map? Like what kind of problems did you have in those previous maps?
Yeah. Like well, the points that you brought up are pretty valid. I think the biggest issue was the lines of sight it generates, and how much of a player's body is visible at any given time, right? If height variation is very high, then the likelihood is also very high that you get like very head peak situations where you can only see like the top of the head, and the person on the high ground, they can like play with that by walking back and just peeking out and back and forth, which is frustrating for the player at the bottom because their whole body is exposed, right? While the other player is only showing like a little bit of their body. Uh, and yeah, and then the other way around, it could also happen that when you have like something, an overhang or something, you could see the feet of someone before they can see you at all, right? So stuff like this, we really have to make sure that it's not getting too out of hand, really, and it's hard to balance that stuff.
Yeah, well, one of the things that you just mentioned with the feet being on display first is something that I recall noticing in when I played Concert, because that was a map where you had the T's standing there at the amphitheater spot, but then if there was like this central building that had a staircase leading up to the CT spawn, and when they were coming down, it was almost very like, because of the fact that it was a dark model on dark stairs, it was a little bit harder to see for sure, but you could see that there was some movement and be alluded to it before the alerted to it before the CTs really knew that they were even seen in that sense. So is that a situation where you think that could be mitigated by utility usage, like you were talking about with Basalt, where if they just threw a smoke down to that entrance, it wouldn't matter as much and they could get into a good lurk position? Do you think that like it's okay to design stuff around that as long as players are receptive enough to it, or do you think like it's just too strange or bizarre for most players to consider, and like they don't look at it the same way? What do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah. So that's interesting, really, because yeah, that connector was a big problem, and we tried to figure out how we can make it work properly. Like, and I think we did it in a way that allowed the players to get down to the entrance at the bottom without showing your feet, by making the path wide enough that you can like walk along a side of the wall and then not being exposed like that. But yeah, newer players don't know that, right? They can't tell. They just walk downstairs and then they get shot before they can see anything, and that's like a, a point of frustration, which you should really also really make sure that it only happens in a very limited space, and yeah, not in too many spaces, especially in spaces where you can't avoid it. Yeah.
I'm curious about your take on this one. So there's been some talk about like which side you should start on if you've never played a map before. And like a lot of people say you should start on terrorists because like almost, I mean, the whole impetus is to go forward in the map. And so you have to go to at least one bomb site in order to, in theory, complete a round successfully. So in that situation, it's like, oh well, exploration is part of the whole thing. So you should start on terrorists. You should like see what you can do there. But obviously, that's not always how it goes, right? Some people are gonna roll the map in scrimmage mode or something, or in a community server, or in Face It, and they're gonna be like, oh well, I guess I'm on the CT side now, and I've never played this map. So how do you
Yeah.
go about designing maps? Like we've talked a little bit about how to make maps a little bit more approachable for newer players. How do you go designing the different sides to be welcoming initially, and then also on repeat viewings when they come back after the first time they play, they're like, oh wait, I remember this area. Like how do you go about like designing? Is there anything in particular level design wise that you use, any tactics that help with that sort of problem?
Uh, yeah, I think the biggest tactic is to make the choke points really, really obvious. so, so basically, that when you are a city and you don't know where the front lines are, like help the cities to figure out just by seeing an entrance, that okay, an enemy can come out of that entrance like at any moment, like this looming danger that is around the corner, right?
Yes.
uh, and then also to help the cities to feel comfortable in the bomb site and not feeling like they have to move out of the bomb site to have a chance to eliminate the terrorists, is by uh, providing like some very obvious cover that they can take, like half cover or full cover that we can hide behind to look at the door, really, right? So then they know, okay, here I can stand, here I can from here I can shoot into the entrance, into the choke point, right? And then like as they get more familiar with it, they will also notice like other points from where they could hold the bomb site from, which haven't been as obvious. But giving the players at least like 1 or 2 pretty obvious points to hold the bomb site from, that goes a long way, I feel.
So when you were designing Grind, the layout for that particular map, one of the things that I was thinking about, having played it somewhat recently, is that you have like a very initially it's like deceptively complicated in terms of the middle area. Like it seems very simple. You've got the entrance on the T side and then the double doors on the CT side, and it's like, oh yeah, I've kind of played maps that have these double doors or this middle scenario. But then there's the different wraparounds that you can have. Like there's the two entrances that are closer to T. One of them gets them just another way to rotate into the I believe it's the B bomb site, and the other one goes to a bit of a fast rotate to A, and then you've got that upper part that's stacked on top of mid. So it's like you're almost luring them in with familiarity, and then afterwards you're like, but look at all this stuff that's new you've never seen before, or something to that effect. So I was curious how generally that map went. You could go specifically on mid, or just in general some thoughts on the layout. I know it's been a little bit since you actually worked on it, but yeah, I was curious if there was anything that you looked at that map and said, like, you know, looking back at it now, if you have any thoughts on how successful some of the ideas that you had were.
Yeah, so mid and the second mid area that really sprang out of the mind of Man, right? So he made the original layout for it, and I only like assisted him in getting the layout even better, basically, than it already was. At least I tried. And yeah, like mid was quite familiar, like you said. Like Dust 2 was a big inspiration for this, with a double door that we had there, and then adding the spice of having this second connector there. Really, right? I think that is something quite nice to have, like something that players are familiar with, and then adding something, a unique touch to it, really, right? And then yeah, I think that map had like a lot of iteration we had to go through, because like some parts were also a bit too much. Like for the terrorists, the path towards mid, like there was like a staircase that led above mid, and then it's complicated to explain.
And this is one of the
So,
iterations that you had where it was a much
yeah,
more like initial.
it was more complex. It was
Okay.
more complex, and we tried to simplify it because it had like this complexity already with the second mid, and then the boost over this wall that you had on second mid, from which the terrorists could get into the space as well. So yeah, we had to find like ways to keep the unique element of that map, of the middle, but also make sure that it's not going too complex. Yeah, and yeah, I think that's all really to it.
One of the things that I really appreciated about both of the bomb sites there is that while they were open to different extents, obviously the B bomb site had those like two tiny slits that you could throw utility through if you were coming in from the T side. The other one was much more open, and generally speaking, you could find different lineups. In theory, you could practice some stuff like that. And this is kind of in stark contrast. I mean, obviously Basalt also had this as well, but in Engage, there's much less opportunity for utility to be thrown on the bomb site. You can throw some utility like on the approach to the bomb site to different checkpoints. Like I'm thinking if you go in towards the A bomb site, there's that little nook where a conveyor belt like moves a piece of a car through, and so you can like throw flashes or Molotovs or whatever through that. Obviously, if you pop open the red door, you can then try to exec a little bit or isolate like from hut or something like that. But generally speaking, if you're going to be throwing utility, it almost has to be like after you've taken the site and then you're trying to do it in a way to like counter utility or lockout. What's your thoughts on how the different maps that you've worked on, specifically how Engage differs in this regard when it comes to like offering paths for utility to be used by both teams, generally speaking?
Yeah, so it's really interesting that you mentioned the small slits on B side on grind, because that caused us issues as well. Because at first all the windows were open on B side of grind, and players could throw through all of them their utility, and it was way too easy for terrorists to take the bomb site thanks to those. So we started closing the windows like one after another, and I think I'm not sure anymore, like how we ended, where we ended up with.
It's just
But
the
I
two
think
that are
we.
like right above the door, basically. So
Oh, okay, yeah. Because I think at some point we even closed all of the windows, um, because terrorists had it too easy to just run and throw a utility into the bomb site, and everyone was flashed, for example, right? So that was already like something that a problematic point. Um, yeah, but on Engage A side, it actually has windows from mid. I think you missed them in your review, and
oh,
I
I
was.
most likely did. Yeah. Are they really high up or something like that?
Yeah, they are pretty
Okay.
high up. Yeah. So terrorists have a way to throw utility into the bomb site from mid. Like so, but they have to take. No, they don't even have to take control of the bomb site. They can stand behind that half wall there and then throw from over there. Um, but it's like really high up, like you said, and it's not really easy to line up any grenades for sure.
So
Um,
definitely more on the like the travel time would be such that you kind of have to use smoke grenades. Like maybe flashes wouldn't flash anybody, and other grenades would just detonate before. So it would be something where they can definitely line up some smoke utility, which can be
yeah,
pretty impactful, but ultimately would be like more
yeah,
limited in than just a more open bomb site like Grind or something like that, right?
exactly. Like Um, I, I think on Engage, we don't really need to rely on too many openings for utility to be thrown into the bomb site, like on maybe on our site, bomb sites, uh, is because that each bomb site has two entrances for the terrorists already, which is uh, quite, you could say it's more than most other maps do, right? Like most other maps have two entrances on only one bomb site, but the other bomb site only has one entrance.
Right.
And Engage has two on both bomb sites and even has two entrances into mid for terrorists, right? It's like six entrances, like on paper, really, yeah, that the terrorists can come from. And giving them additional ways to make use of their utility is not really that that important anymore because they have like all these entrances they can come from, and from those entrances they can throw their utility into the levels. So I feel on it's balanced like that basically on that map.
What was the decision making behind having very few, if this might be another thing where you can correct me if I'm coming at it from a wrong angle, but from what I was able to discover through repeated playtests was that there wasn't that many like wall bangable surfaces, for example. There weren't
Mm.
too many things where you could line up some shots through some textures or anything like that,
Yeah.
and a lot of the windows couldn't be broken, for example, and whatnot. So what was the thought process behind that? Was that just like a default assumption, or did you guys think like, well, if we did this, it would break the balance in certain ways? Like, what would
Mm.
you say to that?
Yeah, no, we the wall bangable thing is actually also quite a 1.6 kind of thing, which where you were practically able to bang through all the walls, right? Um, and that is not really very common in CS:GO maps anymore because it is for newer players again like a point of frustration when they get shot through a wall from halfway across the map, right? Um, of course, it happens every now and then. Like Overpass has this like happening
Yes, in
still
spades. Yeah, they're
nowadays.
still
Yeah.
finding new ones.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's not, but those are not really intentional, right? So the intentional wall banks, they also really have to be very clearly communicated and used rather sparsely to prevent like frustration for newer players. Because if they get frustrated early on, they will never pick up the map again, and they will miss out on all the great games they could have on it, right?
Of
So,
course. But
so
it's an interesting topic you're touching on right now. Is the whole idea of players initially adapting and adopting a map, like picking it up and saying this is like a map I want to continue playing. And
yeah,
it's something that I feel like I'm sure that to some extent there's got to be a little bit of a chip on mappers' shoulders because Valve comes in with Overpass or Vertigo, and these maps are completely different than anything anybody's experienced before. And there's definitely a lot of frustration from people who are playing it. Like if you remember the early pass of Vertigo from earlier last year, where they had all of these different spammable things on the A bomb site, the whole wall thing was marked as spammable, and there's like some infamous screenshot of just it was riddled with bullet holes after a pro match because that's all they did was spam it for like an entire round basically on both sides. So
Yeah.
in a situation where you're Valve and you have the ability to just force this map on and say, all right, you guys, this is a map now, enjoy playing it. And like people just have to deal with it. I mean, they can kind of avoid the same process that you guys have to do where you guys have to account for whether or not somebody might voluntarily play the map because it's not something that's getting officially added in the same way. Are there any other sort of differences in the design philosophy that you think that Valve generally employs? Like, do you think that they have a similar philosophy to some of the mappers that you've seen in the custom space, or do you think that the way that they go about making their maps and iterating on their maps is just like very different?
They definitely have a lot more resources available than we do. Um, they they can push out a map, and then instantly after a day they get like thousands and thousands of data points they can
Yes.
use to make design decisions, improvements, right? Like Overpass, when it first released, it was really a tricky map because it had like a lot of issues with Bombsite B, for example, where the terrorists got earlier there, and then it had too many entrances and so on. And now it's like this. I would say it's this masterpiece really that they have created, and so stuff. And these resources we don't have available as community mappers. We have to be kind of a bit more conservative with our decisions because alienating players can be something that happens really quickly, and then they will not give it the map another chance, really.
Yeah, it's like negative
So
word of mouth as well, right? Because if they tell two friends and those friends tell two friends, then suddenly your
yeah,
reputation precedes you, and nobody's really interested in trying it out potentially anyway, right?
yeah, exactly. Like uh, that's kind of like just how it is, right? But yeah.
One of the things that I'm always curious about people who have actually designed like at least the number of levels that you have as an example, I'm always interested in their take on the existing maps that we have in the map pool. Like something that I've always done on these interviews so far is ask them about Vertigo, right? But just in general, since you seem like you know the map pool and how the many iterations they've had, like you can probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm pretty sure the first iteration of Overpass didn't even have long on A. Is that correct? Do you remember that far back? I feel like I remember a version of that map that didn't even have the A long area, or it was
Oh,
much different than it was before.
I can't tell anymore. The only thing that was stuck in my mind was B bomb site and how problematic it was when it first released. But yeah, also like lately, I'm not playing very much CS:GO anymore, and I'm not really in the loop of how maps are working right now. Like Vertigo, the newest changes. I'm not too familiar with them anymore. Like I kind of lost a bit of touch of what's going on in there. So
Do you think that that's just because you got busy or something like that, or do you think there was like a part of you that stopped being as interested in the game in terms of playing the game as you were before?
yeah, so I think I've been making maps for CS:GO for a very long time now, and I've been basically in this bubble of playing only CS:GO and maybe two other games, and that was it, right? Uh, and lately, these past 2 years or 3 years, I would say, I started branching out really and looking at other games uh, and not being in this bubble really where you just experience one game throughout the whole year
Of course, yeah.
without like the world of games is so big. It's like it's massive, and there's so many great games out there. And uh, yeah, I feel like people really need to go out there and explore all these things because it's a shame to not try them all out.
Well, in that vein, I have a question for you about inspirations in general. Do you have you played any games lately that have inspired you in a way that you think might rub off on a future map, or do you have any existing maps that you've worked on level design wise that you're like, all right, this is gonna sound weird, but I have this other game that I've been playing and they tried this in a level and I want to try it in a CS:GO level. Anything like that? Any bit of crossover?
Hmm. No.
Too different, you think? CS:GO is just it's one thing and you can't really draw anything back to it.
Yeah, it's quite different. I can't really think of anything like for my most recent blockouts that I've been working on, my inspirations for those were really just real life experiences, like the CS Climb, for example. There's a blockout that I'm currently working on that is inside a climbing hall, and I just visited the climbing hall once, and I thought it was so cool in there that I was like, okay, we have to reproduce this, and I think. Yeah, I'm sure there's like a lot of examples of things that you would like to recreate from other games in your game, but it kind of loses its value if you copy from another game, because or not copy or get inspiration from it, but how do I put it? Yeah, it's basically that other game that had this very specific thing um, was also looking at a reference, right? They took probably a real life reference as an inspiration for their decision, and you're then looking at that game and not at the reference. So it's like I'm making a comparison now, is that when you make a new key, yeah, and you copy it from the original, right? And then you copy from the copy the key, the value of the accuracy of a key gets worse, right?
Yes.
So over time, if people keep copying from another map and or drawing inspiration from it directly, um, the key doesn't turn anymore at some point, right?
Yeah,
And
the
you don't
concept
know
doesn't
why.
work anymore or something like that, right?
Yeah. Or the the general gist of like the essence of that unique thing gets lost over time, really, right? So that's why I would rather like to, for layout things, look into real life examples of things that are looking interesting than on other games on how they do certain
Let's go
things.
deeper on that then, because we've talked about adapting 1.6 maps to CSGO. How do you adapt real life to CSGO? Like, what kind of concessions do you have to make when you look at some pictures, or you just remember an experience that you had, like in the climbing hall? How do you make
Yeah.
it so that it works for a game instead of it being the way it is in real life? How much changes do you have to do?
Oh, a ton. Like the fantasy, it's like is the biggest issue that the biggest thing you can take away from something, and then like the rough constellation of things, right? Where things are, but lines of sight are definitely not a consideration in real life environments, right? So things are looking really cool in real life, but they have like these really long sidelines or head peaks that can happen, which obviously you don't have to worry about in real life, right? Um, so all of these things you have to take into consideration, and then basically that's where your your own input comes from, right? So you take this rough concept that you have from real life, and then you try to find a way to make it work in CS:GO by uh, creating timings that line up with that choke point, and then making sure that the angles are all right, that you don't have this head peak situation like we talked earlier about, right? Like all these things you need to then take into consideration to make the thing that was your inspiration at first work the first place. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the art of trying to adapt something, right? You always have to do something differently. One of the things I was also curious about, is sort of in a similar line, is we're talking about changing the way that something works because it doesn't work exactly the way it does in Counter Strike, like the way that you want it to. So are there some cases where like you've built in this sort of process where you know exactly like the kind of thinking that you need to get into, the headspace that you have to get into in order to properly change something? Like if there's been a case where, like we talked earlier about grinds opening on the T side being too complicated, and so now you've got to come up with a way that you're making a concession in a way, you're reducing the complexity, you're changing something about the map, and now you're coming up with something better. What's the process like for actually coming up with that better alternative? Like, do you have a process that works for you more often than not, or is it a case by case basis?
Yeah, so I've tried, I think, two different approaches. One is to keep banging your head against the wall really, and make iterations upon iterations on it, and to eventually then come up with a solution, right? That really checks all the boxes. Or another approach is that I tried as well was to take some time and space, like put the map away for a bit, let it soak, right? Go away, concern yourself with other things. Like I had this period where I was making a lot of different layouts, and then whenever I got stuck on one layout, I was like, okay, go to the other layout and iterate on that, right? And then like I always had like a lot of time between the layouts. It worked to a degree. I think what I ended up with is really banging your head against the wall is more efficient, or no, delivers more concrete results, like better results, really. You can maybe in the early stages of a layout you can do this kind of thing, but later on when you have these choke points really in your design process, where you know, okay, this issue is here, and it's not going away by just moving away, right? I have to really tackle this and do something more drastic than just smaller changes, like rip the whole part of the map out and try to make something completely new, and then see if that is better or not. If it's worse, scrap it again, right? And you have to do it, and eventually you will come up with something good. What also helps definitely in this whole process is to just talk with people and get their feedback on these things, right? Just the act of talking without even them having to give you any constructive feedback is already like helping you get a clearer picture of what the actual issue is, right? So
Yes.
that definitely helps improve the design flow. Yeah.
I'm curious about which method I'm assuming it must have been the method of banging your head against the wall for Basalt, because obviously that was a timed thing. How much did the pressure or expectation of having to deliver at a certain time within a certain constraint, how much did that change the process of developing Basalt?
Yeah, quite a bit. Like I pressured myself a bit by trying to get the layout done to a good degree so that the artists could start working on it, and that like basically made me really push for changes, and then be like, okay, we have to just go with this. Like it's not ideal, right? But making some, I can't find a solution to make this work. Like the green building in mid, right, with a door that leads into middle. I don't think it's a great solution. I think it could get better. It could be there could be a better solution out there. But we had to just go with that, and because all the different variations of it, like I I basically finished all the rest of the map, but that green building, like it was my like how do you say, like this
Nemesis?
uh, nemesis, yeah, that I had to fight this uh, and yeah, in the end I didn't find a solution that was really making me very happy with it, but we had to just push forward and complete it. So that like was one big thing, really. Like if I didn't have this time constraint, I would have spent a lot more time working on that and maybe completely changing how that structure in that area is at all. Yeah.
Is there any interest in revisiting any of those older maps like Basalt that you might have unfinished business with, or do you rather just make some new stuff and move on?
Yeah, no, I would definitely want to revisit Basalt at some point again. Uh, but also, I would like to work on new stuff too, right? so it's like this balance of sometimes you need to let the map rest and say, okay, this is it for the time being until I hear different, right? Like something that gives me like real motivation to go back and iterate and improve on it again. Like I didn't have that for Basalt for the longest time, really, because I was like so exhausted after the contest, and was like, okay, I don't want to touch it anymore. It is a playable, like it was in a playable state when we left it, right? It had no big bugs or anything to it, but design changes I didn't want to do anymore. Just recently, I started opening it up again and just fixing bugs that have been accumulating over the time that I haven't touched it. Big shout out to Fnags, who found all the small issues that I had in that map, and then I fixed those. We submitted those, but the as is, I think it is a solid map. Is it perfect? Obviously not. I think at some point I might want to go back and try to fix this damned green building. But at the moment I like to focus on other projects I have.
Sometimes, having unfinished business with one thing can give you all the motivation you need to work on something completely different, like you're saying. Is there any case of, like, looking back at any of the maps that you've made, doesn't have to just be Basalt, but any case where you're like, I really wish I had done that better, or that actually really worked well, but the rest of the map didn't do it justice? Is there something that you would like to take from an earlier map that you had and sort of, try it again in another context, in another map?
There's this super old map that my first real map, I would say, called Bagra. That map, I feel it had this uniqueness to it, which I'm chasing, and I feel like no other map that I'm doing is really capturing that. And but it has flaws all over the place. I'm not gonna lie. Like the path to be bomb site, it's just like flat and it's super boring. And then it has this pit behind it, which what was I thinking back then about it? Like, but maybe it's like all these imperfections which make a map also more charismatic, really, which makes it stick in your mind more than other maps, maybe, right? So I would love to go back to Bagra at some point and try to capture what made it so fun in the first place, but fix all the issues that I had around it. Like I think the mid was the strong suit, the middle area, but I kind of didn't get it right at that point, and maybe someday. But on that topic also, it's just that when you I actually had like 2 attempts at making a Bagra remake over the years, and both fell flat because I feel like the issues that I tried to fix, they propagated throughout all the map, and then I ended up with something completely different, where I was like, okay, this is not what I wanted. I'm having a hard time to make a successor to that map that is worthy, really. And so sometimes it really is actually better to just let it rest, start something new, and take your learnings from those maps and apply them to the new ones.
The idea of like making a sequel to an existing map is always really interesting to me, especially in the case where maybe it's a layout inspired by or something, but there's no real story in Counter-Strike. So there's really not that much to like make a sequel to in a conventional sense. But obviously this happened in a weird way with Bubkiz, where he had Mirage 2, but it was actually, I believe it was actually Thrill. It was the layout that would become Thrill
Yes.
eventually. So the idea that, he's calling it Mirage 2, maybe for name recognition, maybe also because maybe there was some inspiration between the two maps. What do you think makes a map in your eyes, like what do you really want to make a sequel to, or why would you want to make a sequel to a map like that? Like what was it about Bagra? Was it just the fact that Bagra had like all of those different things that made it the way it was that you're trying to recapture? Was it the fact that it was like your first proper attempt at a map that got finished? Was it a little bit of everything?
Yeah, I think it was the magic of having your first map, really, and like learning the ropes and then playtesting. Like I remember those playtests from back then, like quite fondly, because I used to be a lot better back then, or the other players were not as good.
Hard to know,
like
yeah.
like nowadays, like, oh man, it's crazy. Like the mapcore community itself, it has so many good players now. I can't keep up with them, even if I tried. But yeah, like I think that is something like the magic that you had back then, like the naivety. I guess you could also say about how things could be, right, and or should be designed. Yeah, I think that was the main thing. But yeah, but other than that, what makes a successor, right? That was like the real question, right?
Yes.
What makes a successor to the previous map? Tough one. Like I feel if you look at Dust and Dust 2 as well, right? What 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 uh, what resemblance do these two maps have, right? They have the architecture is quite similar, right? And they have a double door as well. Like I think maps, a sequel should have something that links it to the previous map, but only an element, right? Like the double door, for example, or you had like this ramp, right, in Dust 1 that goes down to this underpass area. Like you can have like these small points of reference, right? But obviously you can't just take mid from Dust 2, make Dust 3 with the exact same middle, and then
Right.
everything else is different. Maybe that won't really work, right? It's like, and that comes with time as well, right? Like players will play a map, and then you learn like what is the recognizable bit about your map, and you try to capture that in your sequel.
I feel like Dust 2 is a weird case too because nobody remembers Dust 1. Most people who play Dust 2 probably have never played Dust 1, right? Or maybe
Yeah,
they've played Short Dust or something in a Wingman mode or something like that, right? But they usually have not played
yeah.
the full map because it's been out of the rotation for so long. So I'm curious to your thoughts about Dust 2 because it's another one of those maps that you don't have to play the game recently to know what it's like. It really doesn't change that much. You know, even with the remake where they redid the art on it, they didn't do too many gameplay changes. The only thing I think recently was that they opened up the skybox for more nades to be allowed through from the B tunnels, and that was pretty
Yeah.
much about it. So what's your take on Dust 2 generally speaking? Do you think some people view it as like this, you know, the sacred cow, and then some people view it as maybe a little bit overrated? And are you partial to either one of those things? Do you have any thoughts that might be more on the controversial side, or are you a fan?
Oh, this map is awful. No, I'm kidding. No, it's a great map. It it has this beauty and its simplicity, really, right? But it's not too simple either, right? It has like this. Uh, it has this magic to it, right? It's like the middle that has this super long sideline where the T's can look through the door, and when they see people passing towards B side, it's like, yeah, it's something that I think even maps, if they try to really to capture the same spirit, they wouldn't succeed in it because it would feel like a imitation, right? Um, so I feel it is it is a great map in itself. Architecturally, maybe when you look at it, doesn't maybe to make too much sense. Um, that might be something that nowadays, if a map like that would come out nowadays, people would be complaining about, like B catacombs. Like why is there this corridor that leads to nowhere, right? Like I think the newer version it makes a much better attempt at justifying like the space, but the previous version it was really didn't have any doors or what is the purpose of that building, right?
Right,
Right?
not
Or
very much like grounding in the environment.
yeah. And I think that's something that nowadays uh, people are complaining about on new maps, that everything needs to make sense somehow, right? It is a bit problematic in some sense, because great layouts sometimes need to be unrealistic, right?
Yes.
No, not sometimes. Like in CSGO, pretty much always need to be realistic to some degree, but they need to somehow sell the story that you can, ignore these issues or like issues with how realistic it looks like. So I think layout wise, very solid and easy to learn, hard to master. I think that is something that Dust2 layout does really well as well. And it has some imperfections as well, which make it more charismatic, like the B entrance, the terrorist entrance into B side, right? It's this long corridor. It's like it's a death trap, really, if you look at it. But it works, and the players have learned over the years how to use it properly, right? Like the B rush, it's like now something of the culture of the game, right? And
Yes.
that is basically thanks to Dust2, because terrorists are able to rush B with utility and just go into the meat grinder, and it's like such a unique moment that happens in that game and that map, right? So stuff like these, I think, make that map really outstanding.
Looking more at you're talking about flaws and how they can be looked at as ways that actually improve the flow of the game or the flow of a specific map. I was curious as to which rules certain Counter-Strike maps break, but for the better, generally speaking. Like, some people would say Dust2 breaks the rule of, with the setup of mid, where you can snipe somebody in the first 5 seconds of the round, basically, or you can get information very, very quickly, and that's like a unspoken rule, but a rule of design, where most of the time you can't have action that early on, or you can't have something that impacts the round that significantly that early on. Yet Dust2 does it to great extent. It's one of the things that characterizes the map. Some people will complain about it, but generally speaking, it's like the only map that does that, really, that I can think of. So are there any other examples you can think of, either from community maps or Valve official maps, that where they break a rule and under normal circumstances this would be a really bad thing, but somehow they make it work?
Okay. Well, they break a rule but make it work to make it better.
Yes.
Debatable. Like, I think Train is quite unique in itself. I think like a lot of the official CSGO maps are actually having something unique to them that makes them rule breaking. Like Train with a very unconventional A bomb site, which is like this long train yard, right? And also Nuke with two bomb sites above each other, right? Like all these are things that I feel like a community map can't really afford doing as freely as the official CSGO maps. The question is it because we have to be more conservative about our designs because we don't have the resources available? Or is it also because of the history of the maps, that they have been in the rotation or part of the game for so long that it's like basically a given that they are like the way they are?
Right.
But these are like questions of, okay, maybe that's why they are getting away with it, and we don't know. Does it make them better though, right? That's debatable, I think. Like Nuke, for example, the two levels was the biggest issue, was the sound issue, right? Where you couldn't tell if players were above or below, where was the bomb planted, and so
Yes.
on. They solved it, of course, now with different flow materials, right? With a metal floor on B side. But yeah, it's like something that has been an issue also back then, and I think it's another imperfection which makes it charismatic, like Nuke and Train, in their own regards, right? So I think that that's like something that we as community developers can't really do as freely as they can.
Well, there's always so in the talk of the town when it comes to the competitive scene around Counter Strike. One of the things that I hear often from some of the higher tier analysts is that they'll say, if you took the nameplates off, if you forgot who was playing and just looked at the performance of the player, you might have a different opinion than if you put that name on because of the name value. Like maybe it's a star player in the past who's slumping right now, and if you didn't know it was that guy, you'd be like, get him out of the team. He sucks. Get him out. Cut him right now. Maybe in other cases it's like a pariah. It's a player that has got a lot of hate and nobody wants to give him credit. But if you take the nameplate off, they're like, wow, look at this guy. He's the best player in the world or something like that, right? Best player on the team. Great. Superstar. So in a similar vein, we can't really do that with maps in the same way. But I feel like if you took a collection of maps and among them were things like Train and Nuke and Dust 2, and you found some it's an impossible hypothetical, but it's somebody who was an expert at level design and they hadn't seen any of these maps, and they come in and they're like evaluating the maps and giving them a rating. I feel like there might be some cases where they point out some obvious issues like what we were just talking about that end up in some way or another contributing to how good the map actually is. Like the Train example is obviously like the approach from the T approach to Ivy. It's just a huge long corridor. It takes you like 10-15 seconds to actually get down there. And everybody I've seen who critiques maps on a community level, like there was a while where FM Pone was doing these streams for level designers, and he would bring up obvious in his mind issues. And a lot of the times they did seem kind of obvious, like, hey, you shouldn't have these really long rotations. You shouldn't have these endless corridors. But then you look at some of the existing maps and they make those same mistakes. Do you think that there's, like, in a roundabout way, the question kind of is, do you think that people should try to learn to push the envelope by using Valve maps as an example? Or do you think that this, like we were talking about earlier with the resources, the lack of resources that community members have, should they start out a bit more conservative before trying to reinvent the wheel, as it were?
Yeah, exactly. Good point about the reinvent the wheel thing. I think that's something that I've seen a lot over my years when playtesting on MapCore. That newer designers or mappers in general, they feel like they can reinvent the wheel by bringing up these very unique mechanics into their game, or like going like really hard with one mechanic and repeating it a lot in a map, right? For those, I feel they should really learn the basics first, like be very conservative with it, like learn what the rules of the game are, and then you can also learn to break them, right? If you don't know what the rules are and you try to break them, then you don't know what you're doing, really, right? And it shows in those maps. So newer mappers, they should try to be rather conservative with their designs, and more experienced mappers. I feel we as experienced mappers have this issue, I would say, that where we are listening to feedback maybe a bit too much, putting a bit too much value on things, and maybe we should be able, like, I have to hold my own nose for it, because I'm like this, right? Like I'm listening to all kinds of feedback and try to make it work for that. But sometimes maybe you should just say, okay, no, this is an imperfection that is intended, right? This is we let it be like this because that makes the character of a map, right? And so yeah, if everyone were to try to make the perfect map, then it would become pretty stale, right? And all the maps would play the same. I think that's what's happening a bit in our community mapping scene.
Right. Do you think that actually, like, what I'm hearing in essence is some of the more experienced mappers like yourself, like Cat Food, like Bubkaz, even if he wanted to come back with another layout, like maybe some of these people should just go, like, in a sense, go wild, right? But it's that like controlled chaos where they have some idea and they think that maybe it could work. But they're not 100% sure, right? It's not, nobody's sure anyway until they test it. But they've got this wild idea. They want to try it. They go in and they throw it in there, and then they release it upon the world and let people figure it out. It's kind of a hard hypothetical because it's so difficult for these maps to actually get made if you're also going to throw in all of the art. Like imagine if you were decided I'm going to go with a crazy plan for Engage, and then it gets all of the art that it gets, and that takes however long it takes, and then you find out, oh, actually my crazy idea didn't work, we got to rework the whole map, and now like half the map needs new art or something. You know what I mean? Like that could be really disastrous for the pipeline and stuff like that. So you don't necessarily want to be doing crazy stuff like that. But maybe that's an argument for playing more around with gray boxes and doing more gray box testing. I've heard that this is like a topic that's been discussed in the map core space in recent months. So I'm curious as to your take on that. Like, where could we start with a sort of group of seasoned veteran mappers who are coming in and they're going to make some crazy map? Like, what could that look like? What could that start out with on a community level?
You're asking me now how we can make a crazy map?
Yeah. How can we put together some crazy maps that are going to change the game forever?
Jesus Christ, that's a tough one. Like, if I knew that, I would make one. Yeah, that's a hard thing to achieve, right? Make a crazy map that might work or might not work, and then
just release it, right? And then put it out
just
there.
release it.
Yeah, see what people think.
I think. But yeah, what is the crazy part, right? What can you make? What is the crazy part? And then I feel that's where it comes into play. That as an experienced designer, that whenever you come up with a crazy idea, you can already think of 3 to 5 different reasons why they are crazy, and you shouldn't do them, right?
Yes.
But maybe you should do them. You should do it after all, right? But then it's like always this, no, I know this doesn't work. I've seen it not work. God damn it, I probably won't make it like this. So I have to find like another way how I can make something properly. And yeah, I think
I actually had a crazy idea in the middle of this interview when you were talking about angles with a lot of height variation leading to head peaks. So do you know about like the gravitational like spinning wheel thing, the concept for the like spacecraft that is in perpetual motion so that you always have gravity wherever you are, you're always like gravitationally centered.
Yes.
Yeah. So what I was imagining when you were giving me the breakdown of like why those head angles don't work and like one player is like fully visible, their whole body is visible, but the other player only has their head. I was thinking of a case where if you were walking on like this curved surface, and most of the time we don't have curves in CSGO maps, I've noticed. It's a lot of hard angles, right? But imagine the whole map or this one area, this hill area was like a curved surface, and the entire way down, you were like sticking out perpendicular to the ground. So if you're walking down a curved angle, you're sticking up as if you're in a curved angle, right? So like, yeah. I mean, at that point, your whole body's visible to anybody who's looking, because anybody's on the floor, they're seeing the whole thing, not just your head. That could solve the problem. I mean, I'm not saying I'm a big brain guy, but just saying, I want to see a map where we see something. And anybody who's in the viewers here.
No, you should do it.
Oh yeah, I should do it. Yeah, okay. I can't put my own line on. They can just blame me, is what I'm saying. I don't have to know how to do it, but there's got to be some crazy stuff. Like one of the things that actually did happen recently was low gravity in the wingman contest that went down recently, right? Yes. So like that was in the Orion map, I'm pretty sure. So given the fact that that's like a completely different approach in a fundamental gameplay mechanical sense, I mean, it's not necessarily going to get picked up by Valve and be thrown in there because of many different reasons, not just the low gravity thing, but probably because they like their themes more grounded. They usually don't seem to pick like science fiction stuff. Even their own lunacy map has like the lore behind it is that it's a movie studio or something. So it's not really the same thing as like being on the moon in the same way. So essentially, I'm curious is like if we're already going for a theme that's kind of crazy, like with the lunar base, moon base style thing, or something that's a bit more fantastical or science fiction or futuristic. if we're already going to do something like that where it's not grounded and therefore Valve probably isn't going to pick it up, then we actually have more freedom conceptually to go crazy, because we're not worried about Valve potentially picking this map up. We just want to make a map and see if it works. So what kind of gameplay mechanics do you think? Is that even a space that you've thought about? Like obviously Swamp had that slow moving swamp field initially before they removed that. Is there anything that you'd be interested in trying out that would completely change the way that the game is played on a mechanical level that might actually work in that map specifically?
Portals.
Okay. Hey, that was actually an FPS mechanic though back in the day, right? Because you could used to be able to telefrag in Quake and stuff, and then the Halo maps in the early Halo maps they had teleporters and stuff. So maybe that could work. You might be onto something.
No, I mean, yeah, that was like a thing that was in all the maps back then, right? Like Diabotical now has also portals in it, right? Yeah, sure, but yeah, in CS:GO it is quite different. For that, we actually can look at Valorant, right? Because they have portals in one of their maps. But yeah,
they also have 3 bomb sites in one of their maps. I'm not sure if we should take their ideas from them. I don't know about that.
Well, no, yeah. Well, it was interesting what their interpretation was, or how they made the portals work, basically, because those portals there, since you also have a very high time, very low time to kill, let's say short time to kill, in Valorant as well, right? So when you come out of a portal and you have to orient yourself first, you're an easy target, right? But in that game, you actually come out of a room that is closed, and you have to open a door, and then you can see the enemies, right? So they solved it kind of like that you have like this safe space, really, this small safe space that you can move inside, which is interesting. Maybe that could be done, but yeah, I have not really thought about like wacky mechanics that you could use in CS:GO for a long time.
It's just been mostly grounded and thinking about how to bend your map ideas to the will of the game as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah. Where I actually had a lot of freedom was the climb map, Creeds map that I worked on with Nux, which that was a complete passion project, right? We knew this is never going to get picked up by Valve, so we're just doing what we like to do, right? And my goal with that map was to make a Creeds map more approachable for new players, right? Just maybe for the viewers, a Creeds map is a map where you have to jump basically up a mountain, and there's like a lot of jumping puzzles where you have to do long jumps, surf like maybe a ramp for a short distance, which is another game mode, but yeah, or bunny hop.
Yeah, it's taking advantage of all the different movement mechanics in the game to give you a different kind of experience.
Thank you. Yeah, that would have explained it much better. Yes, all the different movement mechanics. Yeah, and there I added a bunch of secret rooms, and every secret room had something unique to it, like an invisible floor that you can walk on, right? Or what was it? Invisible assets that only get visible when you get close to them, or like tons of doors that you have to open to get to your goal. Like all these wacky things, and I really enjoyed that because yeah, you have all the freedom in the world. You just do whatever you like, really. Right?
So you can let yourself loose a little bit there, and then you can go back to making the more boring maps right afterwards.
Oh yeah. I think like more freedom. If you're looking for a lot of freedom, I think you want to make like a map that is that has the potential of getting official. I would look at the hostage rescue map, because those maps can be a bit more open-minded. You don't have to worry about as much as diffuse map, I feel.
What do you think the main differences are when you're trying to sit down and develop a map for hostage rescue compared to defusal? Because even though you've concerts like the real quintessential map that you've done in that vein, I figure you must have had some thoughts about like level design as it pertains to both of the maps. Do you think they're similar enough that you could adapt one map easily enough to one or the other game modes, or do you think that like there is a big difference between the two?
I think there's a big difference between the two. Like I don't think diffuse map is structured very similar to a hostage rescue map. I think hostage rescue maps can be actually smaller and simpler than a diffuse map. Can actually say we actually have a good example of maps that have been in the official pool. Agency is a hostage rescue map, and
Yeah.
Putty started thinking, okay, I can turn this into a diffuse map, right? And that ended up being, oh god, please help me.
I can't help you with this one. I'm not sure which one it would be.
Putty worked with Jansel on it. Breach.
Oh, okay.
Course,
I'm very
it's
familiar
Breach.
with that map, actually. I didn't know that that
Yeah.
was the backstory of it. That's cool.
Yeah. It started out as agency, and like we went through a lot of playtest iterations of that map, where he started off as just agency, where he placed the bomb site A on where the terrorists are spawning, and the bomb site B was a thing that he added where the server room is now, right? But yeah, that only worked to a degree, right? He had to make a lot of changes, iterated a lot on it, and nowadays you barely recognize that they are related to each other, right? The middle area has a little bit of resemblance to it, right? But that's almost it. Oh, maybe also a long with the connector to
And
mid.
like the art style of the buildings is a little similar, I guess, as well, like the exterior versus the interior. But it definitely feels like a very different map, especially once they gave it a more recent facelift. So
Yeah, so I feel it's a hard task to make one map for work for the other.
do you have
Both.
any particular thoughts on the development process of Concert, even though it was so long ago? I did hear that at some point that you were initially interested in putting it in trying to get Valve to pick it up, but they said something to the effect of they won't accept that theme or something like that because it was a little too real for the game.
Yeah, the timing was really was unfortunate because there were like these terrorist attacks happening uh,
Yes.
in concert venues, right? So I wholeheartedly agree that yeah, releasing that at that time would have been troublesome. Is that the only reason why it hasn't been picked up? I don't know, but I feel that that was a big contributing factor. Yeah.
Was there something that you have any thoughts on as a topic generally is like how the communication is between Valve and map and the community mappers? Because I feel like on the one hand, the community generally seems to get a decent amount of feedback from Valve on certain things. But if they don't pick up a map or if they don't respond to you, in some ways it's kind of difficult to know what the reason was. Like you were just alluded to there, like maybe there was some layout related issues with Concert that would have perhaps harmed its chances no matter what the political circumstances were, right? So is there some area where you think Valve could without too much difficulty actually do a better job of like informing the mappers about how their maps might be better optimized for what the kind of gameplay they're looking for, or do you think it's good that they're hands off?
No, you're right. Like on concert, they gave us feedback that told us like, okay, maybe if you remove the concert themed elements from the
Right.
map and give it like give it another skin, basically, or say it's not a concert, but maybe an expo. How do you so an expo, right?
Right, a
Uh,
convention of some kind, right?
a
Like
convention,
yeah.
yeah, some convention. Um, then it could work, right? And then they also had like concerns about some areas being too dark. I think that we addressed afterwards. But yeah, changing like the whole theme of the map, it was actually would have been actually quite a bit of work. And I'm not an artist myself, so I was relying on Skybex to make the call there, and I think we decided to not go ahead with a theme change because it would be too much work.
So do you think generally speaking Valve is decent enough with the way that they respond with feedback as far as like
Oh,
in
oh yeah,
other cases, do they generally have a good sort of grasp on the feedback that they give? Because you were talking earlier about how maybe some of the more experienced mappers in the community listen too much to regular old people who provide feedback, like the Face It players or something like that. Do Valve provide feedback that's useful generally, or are they more on the silent type?
No, so whenever we received feedback, it was spot on, I think. So it was always really good feedback that they gave us. The only issue is that they do it a bit too little. Right? I would wish for them to talk to us a bit more, be more open, like maybe have like an open channel of where we can actually talk with each other, have like a proper conversation, and see like what the points are in a map that are troublesome and what we can do to improve them. But more often than not, you hear nothing back really. And you then have to guess yourself. Okay, it's not good enough in this regard. So maybe what is it? What else can I do, right? And this is like not a great state for us community members to be in. Like, what is it that the map is lacking, right? Of course, and I completely understand like why they don't do it as much as I'd like them to, because there's just so many of us, right? But
It's a good problem
yeah,
to have, though. It's like a embarrassment of riches. There's so many good mappers out there, right? So
yeah, like yeah, for them it's definitely great to have like this big community, and we can help each other out, right? But it would be great if they could give us a bit more input on our works.
one thing that I was kind of surprised about generally is how the way that Valve approaches the community side. It's evolved over time. Where previously, when operations were more common, they had that system where they would just take on a number of maps, and there would be some compensation associated with that. And there was a recent discussion where people were talking about the fact that generally speaking, with the new system, it's the pay is less, but the compensation is less, but also the opportunities are in general are less. There's only a few maps at a time, and they're on like more strict scheduling. Is there a situation there where you think there could be a tweak made to that would improve everything, generally speaking, as far as the injection of community maps into the major like player base and the way that they approach it?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I don't think there's a small tweak that they can make to make it work. I think it would need a bit more work for sure for them to actually implement it properly. Uh, for for them to see a return, really, and also for the community to accept the maps, right? So we have a scrimmage pool, right, where players can play without consequences, but it's not really as far as I can tell, maybe I'm wrong there, it's not getting the response that maybe the community members would be hoping for, right? Because the maps are still not getting played very much, but are in the scrimmage pool, right? Um, so so maybe I feel like there needs to be a way to force the competitive scene, the professional players, to be more adaptive and play new maps in tournaments and so on. Like maybe not. Of course, you shouldn't go too crazy, but one wildcat map, maybe in one tournament, that is from a community, and that is in a rotation to actually give players a way to see how the pros are playing them and then trying to imitate or learn from them, right? Um, or I don't know. I lost my. Where did I want to
There's ways
go?
to link it up between the professional side and the casual side. Like one thing that I was
Yeah,
thinking of is maybe there would be a mandatory like 6 month or maybe even 1 year long stint of a single map pool, and then some stuff gets changed, one or two maps at a time. If we're going to have two majors when the whole pandemic situation subsides, maybe that after the major that happens. People have suggested that before, but I also think that maybe you can speak to this with your when you think back to the overall history of Counter-Strike. But I feel like Valve has tried in some ways to combine the professional scene where they've got one map pool, and they try to like sort of combine that with what the average player plays in matchmaking. And so they'll have the combination there where you have this active duty map pool, which is used in tournaments, and they try to keep that 1-to-1 ratio, like always the same deal in matchmaking as well. Whereas you could have a situation where the pros maybe vote by committee on which maps come in and which maps leave, and those could be separate votes if they wanted it to be. So like maybe everybody's tired of Mirage and Dust 2, so those go out, and then somebody votes in Anubis and somebody votes in Cache or Swamp or Basalt or something like that, right? And so there could be situations like that where the pros take their own destiny into their own hands with a vote, and then it's like the pros themselves voting for themselves, and then the community at large could either choose to keep it the way things are, keep it in standing in keeping with what the pros voted, or maybe they vote for some other maps, and that's like another way for that sort of thing to work out. Do you think, you said earlier you don't think it's a small tweak that they could do? Would there have to be a large change to the system in order for community maps to have like a more guaranteed legacy in the future? Because it does seem like we're seeing fewer and fewer maps get added officially.
Yeah. Like I think the game itself has this problem, you could say. It's not a problem. It's a strong suit, but also a problem. That the game is, the maps in the game are a lot about map knowledge, right? All the utility that you can throw, all the lines of sights and the timings that you can have, right? This is all something that you have to learn over and over, like over a longer period. It's the mastery that is really in that game, right? And if you add like new maps to it, all the players will have to unlearn, well, not unlearn, but all the things that they learned for a certain map are gone, right? They were lost, right? So that is, I think, like a problem that needs to be, that I don't think that can be really tackled, right? It's like the game can only handle so many maps at a time. So yeah, that is really like a one problem really that maybe the game has, that the players have to learn a lot, have to spend a lot of time learning how a map works, and then they want to stick to it because they are familiar with it, right? They've put so much hard work into it. But I think maybe there's a way, right? But like the Mapcore Hub community, for example, they are playing new maps all the time, right? Or maybe they would like to play new maps more often if there were. Like I think they are also running out of maps nowadays. But there is definitely a player base that is craving new maps, but it's maybe not as big as we'd like it to be, right? To be actually worth the effort for Valve to have that in the game, because I think most of the player base is more of a convenience. They like what they are familiar with, and they like to hone their craft by replaying the same maps over and over again.
It's a question as well, or I think an open question is whether or not Counter-Strike players, both on the professional level and on the more casual level, are too inflexible and they don't adapt. They're not willing to adapt to the sort of point that you were making earlier about them having to learn some new stuff. But the other thing is almost like it's and anytime you have a situation where you find a trend, you almost have to ask like how much of that trend is self-perpetuating, how much of that is because there's not the opportunity to break that trend, right? How much of the small player base of custom maps is because there's not really an officialized easy, convenient way for these players to go into the main game client instead of having to go to Mapcore or Faceit and play a custom map, right? In the same way that they can do if they go through those extra steps. And how much of the players not being interested in adapting is because they're never really incentivized to in a positive way, right? Because if you give them the opportunity to, if you have like well-balanced new additions to the guns, for example, like if the Krieg, the SG was not so powerful to the point where it was last year, it was all super dominant, but it was a powerful but expensive option outside of what you currently had otherwise, like maybe then they would be like, oh, well, I can pick this up if I have the money, there's risk reward on a gameplay balance sense, but I'm also incentivized to get better at this new gun and adapt and change my skill set in the same way that maybe there's an incentive to get better at a new map because they people vote out one and vote in another, or something to that effect, where it just happens by Valve's decree. So do you think that there's a case where you almost have to at some point worry that if we don't do enough to change up the way that the game is structured and the way that the scene is structured, that we're going to end up, not being able to adapt at all? Or do you like, not to say that there's any doomsday speak about Counter-Strike dying, because it's lasted so long as it is. So it's not unlikely that that would happen. But do you think that we're missing out on an opportunity to improve the game state for pretty much everybody, for mappers, for people who want to play new maps, for the pros as well, who can become more fully fledged professional players because they've learned so many different skills, because they've been incentivized? Do you think that there's like a missing link, or do you think most people are just happy with the way it is?
Yeah, I think most people are happy with the way it is. Like, I've seen some numbers floating about at some point somewhere, where you saw that the vast majority of players is playing Dust 2 and Mirage, right? And then all
Right.
the other maps they're like in the single digit percentage, right? So that paints a very clear picture of what the majority of players really enjoys. But yeah, like, it could be, it's something that you have to be a bit careful about. But giving players more incentive to try out new maps, it could work to a degree, where and then maybe it holds itself by itself. So giving the players like extrinsic motivation to ease them into these new maps, what it could be, I can't really tell. Maybe some sort of in-game currency, or like everything that they already have available in the game, like skins and so on, right? Um, I mean, during the operations, they kind of did it like that, right? Where you had these roadmaps where you had to do a certain certain map, and do a certain objective on that, right? Um, but maybe that didn't work out as much as we wanted, because the issue could be that the maps might get played at the start because of these extrinsic motivations, but once they are gone, the players don't feel this intrinsic motivation, right? From them, they want to play more maps more, right? There's actually been like experiments been done with that, where children were paid to draw pictures, right? Not paid with money, but with sweets, right? And they like doing it. They did it a lot, right? But then the payment has been removed, and the pictures after the children afterwards were not motivated at all. Like, almost all of them were not motivated to draw pictures anymore, right? And then they had like this other group, where they had these children that were asked to paint without any compensation, and they kept their motivation like throughout, right? And in the end, there was more children still painting pictures than not, right? I think there was a third group, but I forgot what that group did.
It's an
So
interesting, like,
maybe the secret is there.
yeah, you never know, right? It's interesting to point to that kind of example too, because it's almost like the same mechanic that you're using when you have like all the pretty pictures on the workshop page. It's like, hey, check out my map. You should come in and check out my map, and that's like an incentive to check it out, because if it looks cool, if it looks like it's really interesting and dynamic, or something different than what you've ever seen before, you're more likely to subscribe to the map and download it, and then give it a run with some bots, or some friends or whatever, or check it out on the Mapcore Hub or anything like that, and then a percentage of the people who are incentivized by that will stick around and continue playing after the fact. And so I do feel like maybe there could be a couple of extra steps that Valve takes in that sense. And just like there's, it's like on YouTube when I put together a thumbnail for the video afterwards, and I try to make sure that it's like somebody smiling, and then like that's the centerpiece, and just like draw you in. It's oh, we're having a good time over here. You should check this video out.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a similar thing. It's not just a Counter-Strike thing, but I do feel like there's definitely a further conversation could be had, right, on that whole idea of how Valve might be able to incentivize it in a way that's not destructive, because it's not like a payment thing, like you were saying.
Yeah. No, like, good point. Like, I can maybe see if they add incentives, that have like the different stages to them, right? I think they did. Oh, they actually did that, I think. But maybe they should go even further. Like, and the operations, you had this coin that you could level up the more you
Right.
play these operation maps, right? Maybe something like this could be done for each map, and but then give them, or for custom map pool in general. Let's do it like this, maybe. And then give them like a really long-term goal that can only be achieved after playing 500 matches or so, like something that they can always like move towards to, which is like really far in the distance. And then of course you can have like pieces in between to fill the gaps to keep the players motivated, right? But that like is work, right? And maybe that effort is invested elsewhere better, right? So for them, right?
Of course, yeah.
We can't tell. We can't tell really.
We're getting pretty deep into this one. We're almost 2 hours in, so at the risk of going
Okay.
any further than we have already, I wanted to ask a couple questions about like a bunch of other stuff. I wanted to go deep on like danger zone, if you had any ideas on that and stuff like that. But that might just have to be saved for a future appearance if you ever feel like coming back on. But since we're
Yeah,
we're
sure.
so deep anyway, I was curious if you had any other thoughts or final topics or like any sort of last word on anything that we talked about here, from map design to the way Valve could approach things. Anything you want to say before we end it?
Yeah, sure. 2 hours, Jesus, the time flies. No, let me just maybe give credits where credits are due. Like, when we talked about Highlands, that map, for example, Elmo Rose and Electro Sheep, they did the bulk of the work, right? Like pretty much almost everything they did, right? I only went in at some point where to rework the B bomb site a bit and make some small adjustments to also the A bomb site and some cover placement adjustments in general. But the major bulk of the work has been definitely done by those two, and I feel they are really talented. And I would love to see the map get finished at some point. So but that's really like up to those two if I want to continue with it. Grind was the work of man. Most like the the grand scheme of things was the work of Man. Art was done by the horse strangler. So they are also deserve like a lot of credit. Concert, Skybex helped me a lot with the layout as well there. So big shout out to him. I guess I'm giving just shout outs to these
That's
people.
fine.
Um, and Basalt, of course, and Resort. Jansel is an absolute beast. I think everyone in the community can say that he's like the greatest environment artist out there. But there's others who are competing with him, of course, like Horse Strangler, Skybex, and Oliver as well. Who else? Yeah, Catfoot, of course. He's getting better and better with every map. You can really see his art getting improving over and over again. And with Engage, it's like his I think his masterpiece. What else? What else? Who did I hope I didn't forget anyone.
Looks like you went through all the names on my list over here, so I think you might be good.
Okay, cool. Other than that, I maybe one thing I would like to say is for people to also play other games. Yeah, the world of games is big, and it would be a shame to just play only CS:GO, even though it's a great game, of course.
Of course. All right. Thank you very much for your time, man.
Yeah, thank you.